Welcome to Notice and Note Fiction and Nonfiction Review, Part 1. Our agenda for this mini lesson is that we're going to review Notice and Note strategies, including the fiction strategies, contrast and contradiction, the aha moment, words of the wiser, again and again, and the nonfiction strategies, contrast and contradiction, and extreme language. These have all previously been introduced during class, but this lesson will review all of them. Notice and note protocols. Before we begin, let's review. Whenever you are doing anything with notice and note, please remember that you need to be following the color coding process. Use the color of the signpost to highlight. That's how you're going to color code. And anything that you highlight must have an annotation. If it's worthy of highlighting, it's worthy of making a note as to why you highlighted that. What does this mean? So first, let's take a look at notice and note for fiction. Remember that fiction are fantasy pieces. So all of these are going to apply to any kind of made up story, whether it's based in some little bit of reality or not. So you'll see here on our poster, this is a material that is provided for my class as well on your Google Classroom page, that there are a grand total of 6 different notice and note for strategies for fiction. Today, we're only going to look at 4 of these because that is what has been introduced in class. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the pink one, which is contrast and contradiction. So remember that when we're looking for a contrast and contradiction, we should be stopping whenever we notice a contrast between what we observe the character doing and what we expect them to have done. So, for example, if a character loses a close loved one but doesn't seem to be affected by this at all, that is not a typical response. We would typically expect them to be grieving in some way. So that would be a contrast in behavior. The behavior, however, could also contradict their previous behavior or behavior patterns. So if they've been acting honest previously, but all of a sudden become deceitful, then we have a contrast in their behavior pattern. All right. And lastly, you could be also looking for a comparison or a contrast between characters or situations. Many times this is used to highlight the differences between characters or their similarities that would tell us something about their relationships to one another. Or if they're showing us a contrast between situations, whether it is just setting up the setting and showing us how different it is from the reality that we live in, then they're trying to teach us a little bit about the conflict that is going on in this story. So whenever we see these markers in the text, we should start to ask ourselves why they've been included and what they're there to show us. Are they there to teach us about a character, what the character is like, what is motivating them? Or is it there to teach us something about the conflict or the setting? So some of the questions that you can ask yourself to narrow these things down and learn more about why it's in there include things like, why would the character act or feel this way? How do the characters or contrast between characters help us to understand them? Or how might a contrast between situations help us predict the plot or the conflict of the story? So now let's move on to the aha moment. The aha moment is often one that people struggle with. So with your aha moment, this is the light bulb going off in your character's head, or it's the light bulb going off in your head that something's not quite right here. So what you're going to do is you're going to be looking for clues about when the character realizes something that will change the way he or she acts or thinks. All right. Or the character starts to notice some red flags or signs that make them start to question their beliefs or their understanding about the way the world works. Oftentimes you'll see those kind of red flags in fantasy stories that deal with some sort of dystopian kind of theme to them. All right. So when we see those signposts or those flags that tell us, hey, it's time to stop because there is this aha moment coming, or there should be an aha moment. There's the beginning of one. It may take a while, but here's where it's starting. We need to ask ourselves, how is this new understanding of reality or the truth that is being revealed here going to affect the character? How is it going to affect their motivation? How is it going to affect the way they interact with other characters? How might this complicate the situation that they're in right now? Is this what's creating the conflict in the story, or is this a whole new conflict that's coming up? Another thing that you could look at is, what does this new knowledge reveal about the significance of events that may have already happened? So all of a sudden, this aha moment may clarify something that's happened long before this in the story. One great example would be if you have a character who suddenly finds out that all of the things that they've been doing were predicted in a prophecy by another character. That is a common motif or idea that comes up a lot in fables and fairy tales and things like that, as well as modern day hero's journey type stories where there's an idea of fate versus free will. Are all the decisions I make really part of some predestined plan, or do I have control over my future? All right. So let's take a look at the next two. Now we have Words of the Wiser and then Again and Again. So Words of the Wiser is really one of the easiest ones for us to find because Words of the Wiser is almost always going to show up in quotation marks. Words of the Wiser are when another character, usually one that's older and wiser than our main character, offers some sort of advice or insight about life for our character to guide them. It can also be when the character makes a wise or revealing observation themselves. They can also offer advice to other characters based on their previous experiences that may help those characters as well. That's them starting to take over that role of being the wiser guide in the story. So this is where Words of the Wiser gets slightly more complicated. When we're looking at the questions that we can use to help clarify what we should be writing for our annotations, we first need to figure out, are we talking about advice or are we talking about an observation? Because that's going to determine the questions that we ask ourselves in order to get to the point where we have something to write down for our annotations. So if it's advice, the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is the advice giver trustworthy? The reason we ask ourselves this is not because we want a yes or no answer, but that answer is going to then lead us to understanding the answer to the next question more. How might following or not following the advice affect the character? If our main character is taking advice from somebody who we don't trust, who that character really shouldn't trust, how does that affect that character? Are they going to be second guessing themselves as they take that advice and go off on this journey? Is that going to complicate things for them? Is that going to send them down the wrong path? Is it sending them down the right path? Are we really mistrusting this character for no reason? A lot of things could be going on with that kind of thing. All right. If it's an observation, though, what we need to then think about, this is going to be like the quote that looks like it belongs on a poster in a classroom. What is the life lesson that they're trying to share with us in this? All right. And once we can summarize that life lesson, we then need to go one step further. How is that life lesson going to affect our character? How does that observation, that life lesson, apply to other things that I may have seen, or I may have read, or I may have experienced myself? I need to make that connection there. So just summarizing the life lessons isn't quite good enough. I need to make that connection, okay? Making that connection is actually going to build a better bridge in your brain to retain that information for you. This is a key thing especially when you're studying. All right, now let's look at the last signpost that we have for our fiction, and that is the again and again. Again and again is going to be whenever we see things popping up repeatedly. It's going to be things like symbols or phrases, or even when a character gets excited, just them repeating something over and over again can add emphasis to how excited they are or how terrified they are, those kind of things. So if somebody's screaming, no, 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 that's going to come out very different than someone who's just like, no, right? So that repetition of the terms is going to actually add meaning to things for us, and help us to visualize things a little bit more. We can also look for things that are symbols and that pop up repeatedly, and things like that. So we need to keep an eye on those. If the same character keeps popping up at the same time, or if they keep talking about this dark door, or a green light off in the distance, or a white orb that seems to be guiding you, those kind of things. Think about like the voice that's calling from the distance that's unknown, that only pops up for our character when they can hear it. Once we recognize that again and again, then we're going to look at these 4 questions and kind of narrow down what we want to say about this. So first, ask yourself, what does this tell me about the character and their relationship with other characters in the story? If it doesn't really tell me anything, then I'm going to need to definitely move on to the next question, because it's probably something that's being a symbol here. So what do I think this object symbolizes? Where have I seen that object symbolize something before? So for example, if I'm reading a story and they keep talking about an apple sitting on a stack of books, an apple is traditionally something that is used to represent a teacher or learning, because way back in the day, there was this idea that if you wanted to win over the teacher and be the teacher's pet, you would bring them a treat. And a treat back then was something sweet like an apple. All right. So that became synonymous with teachers. That's why during Teacher Appreciation Week and back to school stuff, you always see something with a yellow pencil and an apple involved. All right. So let's move on to the last 2 questions. Why does the author think I need to be reminded of this? Is another great question. Why are they showing me this over and over again? What are they hoping that I'm going to pick up on here? They're sending me a clue for a reason. What are they trying to do? What flag are they trying to raise here? And then last one, could this be an Easter egg, or foreshadowing that I should remember for later? Is this something that maybe is a hint at something that's going to happen later on in the story? Can I predict what's going to happen? This is actually one of my favorite things to do, and my husband hates it, because whenever we're watching a movie, I can usually figure out who the bad guy is, what the twist is going to be really early on, and he gets super mad about me kind of spoiler alerting it for him. But it's just because I teach this that I've gotten really good at seeing those hints ahead of time. All right, now let's take a look at our notice and note for nonfiction. Remember that nonfiction are going to be pieces that we read that are informational, that deal with true events, our opinions or biographies, those kind of things. So that's why I put these symbols up here. I've got like some space symbols, some graphs. The little thing is supposed to be a cog, and a newspaper. So we're going to be talking about the first 2 strategies here, because that's what's been introduced in class so far. And those are contrast and contradictions, and extreme or absolute language. So you'll notice here that the pink in nonfiction and fiction actually have the same title, but what we do with them and what we're looking for with them are different. And in fact, they are the only ones between the 2 that have the same kind of title. So this is the last time we're going to see anything similar between the 2 of them, other than the fact that they're color coded and the fact that, they have the same title here. All right. So contrasts and contradictions for our nonfiction. What we have to look for here is when the writer compares 2 people, situations, or ideas trying to show similarities or differences, or if the writer presents an idea or information that is different from opinions or ideas that we previously held. Or, last but not least, they use words that contradict each other. These are called oxymorons. They are used to describe a person and place or thing. So that's things like saying the biggest little town in Texas. How can you be the biggest and the smallest at the same time? Doesn't quite make sense. That's an oxymoron. They're kind of playing with words and twisting it to make an exaggeration or a hyperbole for us. All right. So when we see these things, what we need to do is highlight them in pink. And then we're going to ask ourselves about what do these differences and similarities matter? Why do they matter? What is the big deal about them? What is important? What is the writer's goal? Is a great question. Are they trying to entertain me? Are they trying to persuade me? Are they trying to inform me about a topic? Are they trying to get me informed about a topic, but they're really trying to also persuade me or trying to get me to see their point of view and agree with them? What is their goal? And then how does this contrast or contradiction support that goal? How are they using this to support themselves? Are they actually trying to mess with my head? Are they manipulating me? Are they only giving me one side of the story, hoping that I'm going to go along with their side before I listen to anything anybody else says? What are they doing with that? And then finally, how might the contrast between ideas help me to understand what the writer actually does want me to know? So if I figure out they're not really trying to mess with my head, what is it they are trying to get me to understand? What is this concept? And how does this visual that they're trying to create with these words help me to understand that concept? All right. And then we're going to look at the last one, extreme or absolute language. So this one can be kind of hard because there's a lot of different language out there and figurative language and words and things like that. So we're going to be kind of mixing and matching up things throughout the semester with this. So you may never see this exact same example twice. So this is when the writer uses words that leave no doubt about something. For example, exactly, always, never, and so on like that. They aren't leaving you any wiggle room. They're saying, this is the way it always is, and there is nothing in between. There's no gray area here. Or the writer uses words that exaggerate or push the limits and create some sort of hyperbole. They are so blown out of proportion that you know that they're being satirical and trying to maybe draw attention to a topic through satire here by making it absolutely absurd. Like, for example, saying he had the greatest man cold ever. So they're trying to exaggerate this thing beyond belief. Or the writer, again, uses those oxymorons to describe a person or situation. And again, I put a little side note on this one to remind you that an oxymoron is two or more words that seem to be opposite to each other or actually are opposite. For example, words like wise fool or legal murder. Like, we all know that murder is wrong, so there's no way that there could be a legal murder, right? But what about protecting yourself? Things like that. It happens, right? Not a good idea, but it does happen. All right, so when we see that extreme language, what we then need to do is ask ourselves, how might that writer be trying to manipulate me again to see their point of view here? What is their point of view? What are they doing with this and trying to help me to visualize? So you'll see that our contrasts and contradictions in our extreme language here have a lot to do with each other. And it's possible that they could intertwine. So you might find something that's a contrast and contradiction that uses extreme language. So what you need to do then is decide, how am I going to highlight this? And the answer to that is, if you're doing it online, basically break it up into two parts. Highlight the first part in one color and highlight the second part in the other color. And then make sure that you're adding an annotation that is clearly attached to the part that is either pink for contrast and contradiction, and that annotation goes with contrast and contradiction. and one that goes with the orange and explains here that they are connected. So you might say that they are using extreme language in their contrast and contradiction to do this with it, okay? All right. So that brings us to the end of our mini lesson here. So I am going to remind you of our protocols one more time. So remember that whenever you're doing anything with notice and note, you need to be color coding the things that you highlight. You're going to color code them based on whatever color is presented to you on those charts that we use in class, the materials that you've been given to use, and the ones that we just went over. So make sure you're using your color code properly. And then don't forget that if you're going to highlight something, every single time you highlight, you must have an annotation go with it. If it was important enough for you to highlight it, then you must have something to say about it. Otherwise, you shouldn't have been highlighting it. All right, that's the end of our lesson. Have a great day and make great choices.